My name is Claire Matthews, and for 28 years, I carried the silent hope that one day my parents would finally see me, finally say they were proud. But at my graduation dinner, the moment I thought would heal everything, my father lifted his glass, looked straight at me, and said, "We wish you were never born." The room went silent. My world collapsed, and then something inside me rose. What I said next didn't just break their mask of perfection. It set me free. I was 28 when I finally admitted to myself that my childhood home had never really been a home at all. Back Bay, Boston was where I grew up, in a pristine white colonial with shutters that gleamed in the sun and a lawn trimmed so precisely it could have been a golf course. From the sidewalk, it looked like the picture of privilege, the kind of place people paused to admire. Inside, though, it always felt cold, as if warmth was something we weren't allowed to bring through the door. My father, Richard Matthews, carried the weight of his law firm on his shoulders and let everyone know it. He was tall, broad, with the kind of presence that filled a room before he even spoke. My mother, Margaret, was his perfect complement. Always polished pearls at her neck, lipstick never smudged her smile, practiced more for cameras at charity galas than for me. Together they were admired in every Boston circle, but to me, they were unreachable figures, demanding and sharp. Growing up, I learned quickly that love in our house was conditional. Praise was rare and fleeting, doled out only if it reflected well on the Matthews name. When I brought home a grade that wasn't flawless, I would see Richard's face tighten, his disappointment heavier than any punishment. Margaret would glance at my report card like it was a reflection in a mirror, calculating how my performance measured against the daughters of her friends. Every success was measured against someone else's, and every shortcoming was amplified. I remember one afternoon more vividly than most. I was 12, flushed with pride, clutching a silver trophy I had won for second place at the middle school science fair. My project had been about the way plants bent toward light, something simple but mine. I burst through the front door, excited to share the news. "Dad," I said, holding up the trophy. "I won second place." Richard looked up from the Boston Globe he was reading at the kitchen table. His expression didn't change. "Second place," he repeated, as if the words themselves left a sour taste. "Who got first?" I hesitated, my excitement faltering. "Emma Johnson. She built a solar-powered car model." Richard folded the newspaper neatly, set it aside, and stared at me with cool eyes. "So you were beaten. You had every resource at your disposal, and you still came home second. You need to aim higher, Claire." He slid the trophy back toward me across the counter as though it were meaningless. Before I could reply, my mother breezed in, perfume trailing behind her. She glanced at the trophy, then at me, her eyes narrowing. "Claire, darling, you look a little heavier than last month. Are you sure those pictures with the trophy will look flattering? You know how important presentation is." Her words hit harder than my father's. I looked down at the trophy, once shining in my hands, now dull under the weight of their judgment. My cheeks burned. All the pride I'd carried home with me drained away, leaving me hollow. "I thought you'd be proud," I whispered, the words barely audible. Richard sighed. "We are proud when you're the best. That's how the world works." Margaret adjusted her pearl necklace in the hallway mirror, not even bothering to look at me again. "Appearances matter, Claire. Remember that." I stood frozen in the kitchen, the air heavy with their indifference. My grip on the trophy tightened until the metal dug into my palm. I wanted so badly for them to see me just once, not through the lens of comparison or expectation, but as their daughter who had tried. But they didn't. They never did. I turned and hurried upstairs, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silent house. In my room, I shut the door and pressed my back against it, fighting tears. The walls were lined with awards and certificates I thought would earn their approval, yet none of them had ever been enough. I placed the silver trophy on my desk and sat on the edge of my bed. The room was dim, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the floor. My chest rose and fell in shaky breaths. I hugged the trophy to me as though it could shield me from their words. That night, I made myself a quiet promise. If they wouldn't recognize my worth, I would prove it on my own. I swore right there in that room that one day I would achieve something no one could dismiss. One day I would show them I was more than second place. And though I didn't know it yet, that vow would shape the rest of my life. My refuge was always my grandmother's apartment in Cambridge, a modest brick building with flower boxes hanging crookedly in the windows. Walking through her front door felt like stepping into another world. The air was warm with the scent of cinnamon and baked apples, and the creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet made me feel instantly at home. Her place was cluttered, but in the most comforting way. Stacks of books leaning against the walls, family photos framed in mismatched wood, a quilt draped over the couch that she had sewn herself. Claire Evelyn Carter said with a smile that reached her eyes, "You're just in time. I baked your favorite." She set a pie on the counter, steam still rising. I dropped my backpack by the door and breathed deeply, letting the aroma fill me. "Grandma, it smells amazing." She waved me into the kitchen, cutting a slice before it had even cooled. "Sit, sweetheart. Tell me what's been going on." I hesitated, perched on the stool, fork in hand. With her, I didn't have to pretend. I could let the mask slip. Dad was upset again. I got an A- on my math quiz, and he acted like I failed. Mom said I need to work harder if I want to make something of myself. Evelyn's brow furrowed, her hands folding over one another. "Claire, an A- is not a failure. That's a strong grade. You're a bright girl and you don't deserve to feel small because of impossible expectations." Her words cracked something inside me. I blinked hard, staring at the pie instead of her face. It doesn't matter what I do. It's never enough for them. She reached across the counter, laying her hand gently over mine. Her skin was soft, her touch steady. "It's not about you being enough, darling. It's about them needing control. Don't let their standards dim your light." In that moment, I felt the tension in my chest loosen. With my grandmother, I was allowed to breathe. Later, we curled up on her couch, books spread out across the coffee table. Her shelves were filled with titles on human behavior, counseling, resilience. She pulled one down, the cover worn, the spine cracked from years of use. "This one changed my life when I was your age," she said, handing it to me. "Carl Rogers. Have you heard of him?" I shook my head, cradling the book in my lap. He believed in unconditional positive regard, that people need to feel valued for who they are, not for what they produce or how they look. It's something your parents don't understand, but it's something you need to remember. I flipped through the pages, fascinated by the highlighted passages and scribbles in the margins. "You used to be a counselor, right?" "Yes. I worked with families, children who felt invisible in their own homes. I wanted them to know they mattered." She gave me a wistful smile. "And now I want you to know the same." I looked up at her, my chest tightening with gratitude. "You really think I'm smart?" Her laughter was soft, but full. "Claire, you have a beautiful mind. You see things other people overlook. You notice feelings, patterns, the quiet details. That's intelligence, and it's rare. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." I hugged the book to my chest, a warmth blooming inside me. For the first time, I believed I might be more than just second place. The night stretched on with mugs of tea and the low hum of the radiator. Evelyn told me stories about her work, children who had been dismissed or silenced, parents too busy or proud to see their kids. She spoke of breakthroughs, the way a simple moment of being heard could change a life. Her stories lit something in me. I imagined myself sitting across from someone one day, listening, helping them untangle the knots inside. It felt like purpose, like destiny, though I didn't dare say it aloud. When I finally stood to leave, the city air outside was crisp. Evelyn pressed a small wrapped package into my hands. "For you," she said. I peeled back the paper carefully. Inside was a worn paperback, its corners bent, the title embossed faintly, "On Becoming a Person." "It's my copy," she explained. "I want you to have it. Con comot tum hon him ga Claire." Protect it. Let it guide you. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. Thank you, Grandma. She kissed my forehead, lingering for a moment. Promise me one thing. Don't let them decide who you are. I nodded, clutching the book like it was treasure. Walking back to the train, the city lights flickering against the Charles River, I held it close to my chest. A thought echoed in my mind, both terrifying and thrilling. Maybe I wasn't destined to be who my parents wanted. Maybe I was meant to be something entirely different. Dinner that night was staged like one of my father's courtroom performances. The dining room glowed under a chandelier, the long mahogany table set with crystal glasses and silver that only came out for guests. Except there were no guests. Only me, my parents, and the heavy weight of expectation. Richard carved into his steak with precise strokes, his cufflinks catching the light. "Claire," he said between bites, "it's time we finalize your college applications. Law is the clear path. With my connections at Harvard, the opportunities will be endless." I kept my eyes on my plate, pushing peas around with my fork. My stomach twisted. My mother dabbed at her mouth delicately with a linen napkin. "And don't forget about the Sullivan girl," she added. "You should spend more time with her. Her father sits on the hospital board. Networking, Claire. It's everything." Their words pressed down on me until my chest felt tight. I wanted to scream that I didn't care about Harvard or the Sullivan girl, that none of it felt like my life. Instead, I stayed silent, trapped between fear and defiance. That weekend, while my parents attended a gala, I sat at the kitchen computer and filled out the online application to Northeastern University. I chose psychology as my major, my hands trembling as I typed. With every click, I felt both a surge of courage and a flash of terror. If they found out, there would be no forgiveness. But the thought of not trying felt worse. Weeks later, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. I recognized the Northeastern crest instantly, my heart pounding as I tore it open in my bedroom. "Congratulations," the letter began. My breath caught. I had been accepted. For the first time in a long time, I felt hope bloom in my chest. I clutched the letter to me, grinning so wide my cheeks hurt. I imagined walking across the campus, sitting in lectures about the human mind, maybe even becoming someone who could make a difference. For once, I allowed myself to dream. But dreams don't stay hidden forever. Richard found the letter 2 days later, slipped into the stack of mail I had carelessly left in the kitchen. I came home from school to find him standing by the counter, the envelope open in his hand. His face was unreadable at first, but then his eyes hardened. "What is this?" His voice was low, controlled, more dangerous than when he shouted. I froze. "It's my acceptance. To Northeastern. For psychology." He slammed the letter on the counter. "Psychology. After everything we've discussed, after the resources I've provided, you choose this nonsense." "It's not nonsense," I managed, my voice shaking. "I want to help people. I want—" Before I could finish, he ripped the letter clean in half, then into quarters, the sound of tearing paper echoing through the kitchen. "You will not waste your future on this," he snapped. "Law, medicine, business. Those are careers. Psychology is for people who couldn't handle real science." Tears burned behind my eyes. "Dad, please." Margaret walked in, then, heels clicking against the floor. She glanced at the shredded letter, then at me. "Honestly, Claire, do you think anyone is going to take you seriously in that field? Especially a young woman. You'll be dismissed before you open your mouth." Her words sliced deeper than the sound of paper tearing. My vision blurred and I felt myself shrinking, my voice barely a whisper. "It's what I love." Richard shook his head, jaw tight. "Love doesn't pay bills. Love doesn't build a reputation. This discussion is over." I thought it was over too, until a soft but steady voice came from the doorway. "Actually, it isn't." All three of us turned. Evelyn stood there, her small frame almost delicate, but her eyes sharp with resolve. She had come by unannounced, carrying her usual tote bag filled with books and a container of soup. She walked into the room and set her bag down, then looked directly at her son. "Richard, you may not value psychology, but I do. I practiced it for 30 years and I know the difference it can make." Richard's face darkened. "Mother, this is not your concern." "It is," she said firmly. "Claire is my granddaughter, and I will not watch you crush her spirit. If you won't pay for her tuition, I will." The room fell silent. I stared at her, unable to believe what I'd just heard. "You can't be serious," Richard said, his voice rising. "I am," Evelyn replied, standing straighter. "I saved for years. It was meant for family, and Claire is family. If she wants to study psychology, then she will," Margaret scoffed, crossing her arms. "You're encouraging her to throw away her potential." Evelyn turned to me, her expression softening. "Claire, look at me. You deserve to follow the path that calls to your heart, not the one imposed on you." Something in me cracked open. For the first time, someone was defending me, not in whispers or behind closed doors, but right in front of my parents. My throat tightened as I nodded, tears spilling freely now. Richard glared at his mother, but he didn't argue further. The only sound was the shred of my acceptance letter still fluttering in the trash. Evelyn stepped closer to me, her hand warm on my shoulder. "We'll get another copy," she said gently. "They can't tear away what you've earned." I held on to her words like a lifeline. That night, for the first time, I felt the faint spark of defiance grow into something stronger. It wasn't just me against them anymore. I had someone on my side. The call came on a gray March morning in 2018, just as Boston was thawing from winter. I was sitting in the library at Northeastern, my laptop open to a half-finished paper on developmental psychology, when my phone buzzed. It was my father, which was unusual enough to make my stomach drop. He never called me unless it was something he couldn't put in an email. "Claire," his voice came through clipped and flat. "Your grandmother passed away last night. Heart failure. The funeral is on Saturday. Be on time." That was it. No softness, no pause, no space for me to process. Just a statement of fact, like he was reading me the weather. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. She's gone," I whispered, but he had already hung up. I sat frozen, the hum of the library fading into silence. The one person who had ever fought for me, who told me I was enough, who gave me hope, was gone. At the funeral, the church in Cambridge was filled with acquaintances from her years in counseling old neighbors and a scattering of extended family I barely recognized. I stood near the front, my black dress clinging to my shaking frame, clutching tissues already damp. My parents stood together like dignitaries hosting an event, greeting people, shaking hands. Margaret smiled politely as if she were at a charity luncheon, while Richard nodded solemnly, but kept steering conversations toward his work at the firm. I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to demand why they weren't crying, why they weren't broken like me. Instead, I just stood there, tears running unchecked, feeling more alone than I ever had. After the service, while people filed into the reception hall for coffee and sandwiches, a lawyer in a gray suit approached me quietly. "Miss Matthews," he said, handing me an envelope. "Your grandmother left something specifically for you." My hands trembled as I accepted it. I tucked it into my purse, unable to open it while eyes were still on me. Later that night, back in my dorm room, I sat on my bed and finally tore the envelope open. Inside was a modest check, enough to cover my tuition for the next year, and a folded piece of stationery in her elegant handwriting. I unfolded the letter, my chest tightening as I read, "My dearest Claire. If you are reading this, I am no longer by your side, but I want you to know that I have always seen you. You have a mind that notices what others miss and a heart that feels deeply. That is not a weakness. It is your greatest gift. You deserve the kind of love you have rarely been given. Don't let the coldness of others convince you otherwise. Live fully. Study what makes your spirit burn, and remember you are worthy of love exactly as you are. With all my love, Grandma Evelyn." The words blurred as I sobbed, my body folding over the page. I pressed it against my chest, rocking slightly, wishing desperately for her embrace. The next day, my parents called to check in. Richard's voice was brisk. The arrangements went well. People were impressed with how it was handled. Margaret chimed in. "You should be proud, Claire. Your father and I represented the family with dignity. They didn't ask how I was. They didn't mention the letter, though I knew they must have been aware of the inheritance. To them, her death was another social performance. To me, it was the loss of the only person who had ever truly seen me. In the weeks that followed, I carried her letter everywhere, folded neatly in my planner. On nights when panic rose in my chest before exams, or when my parents sent me emails full of thinly veiled criticism, I'd read her words again. Each line was a reminder that I wasn't invisible, that someone had believed in me. I poured myself into my studies with a new kind of ferocity. I signed up for extra lab hours, volunteered at a crisis hotline, and joined the Psychology Honor Society. I wanted to live up to the vision she had for me, to prove her faith in me wasn't misplaced. But with every achievement, the loneliness grew sharper. I'd look around at my classmates celebrating with their families and think of the empty seat where she should have been. One night, after acing a particularly brutal statistics exam, I found myself dialing her old number out of habit. The line had already been disconnected. I sat on my dorm bed, and the dark phone still pressed to my ear, tears streaming down my face. I whispered into the silence, "I did it, Grandma. I got an A. I hope you'd be proud." Mini climax. That spring, I stood alone on the quad as cherry blossoms drifted in the breeze, clutching her letter in my hands. I promised myself I would not waste the gift she left me. I would walk the path she believed I could. I would make something of myself, not for my parents, not even for the world, but for her. Yet even as determination filled me, a hollowness remained, an ache that no amount of studying could erase. The first time I really spoke to Jennifer Collins was in the student union, both of us waiting for coffee between classes. She was tall, with sharp green eyes and a tone that carried no hesitation. She noticed the northeastern hoodie I was wearing, the same one I'd practically lived in since sophomore year. "You're in psych, right?" she asked, blowing on her latte. I nodded. "Yeah, developmental focus." She tilted her head. "You're the one whose parents showed up at orientation in matching blazers, right?" My cheeks heated. "That sounds like them." She raised an eyebrow, not unkindly, just blunt. "They seem intense, like painfully so." I tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out hollow. "That's one way to put it." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "No offense, but your parents sound kind of awful. You don't have to confirm it. It's just the vibe I got." The directness startled me. Most people avoided saying anything real about my family, preferring to smile and comment on how polished they looked. Jennifer didn't bother with politeness, and strangely it felt like relief. Over time, we started studying together. In the library, she'd roll her eyes at the way I triple-checked every answer. "You're smarter than you give yourself credit for," she'd say, tapping her pencil against my notebook. "Stop acting like you're one mistake away from being worthless." Her words landed heavier than she probably realized. Not long after, I met Kyle Ramirez in a research methods class. He had a quick grin, dark curls that always fell into his eyes, and a background completely unlike mine. We partnered on a project, and over late nights in the lab, he told me about growing up in foster care, shuffled between homes until he turned 18. "I got tired of pretending to belong somewhere," he said, one night hunched over his laptop. "Now I just decide for myself where I belong." Something about the way he said it struck me. I envied his certainty, his ability to claim his own place in the world. I had spent my entire life trying to fit into one I'd been told was mine, but never felt like it. The three of us fell into an easy rhythm. Study sessions in the library that stretched past midnight, cheap pizza dinners where we split the cost 3 ways, laughter echoing in dorm hallways. With them, I didn't have to perform. I didn't have to worry about posture or grades or appearances. I could simply exist, and that was enough. One evening after a marathon of studying, we sat cross-legged on the floor of Jennifer's dorm room. Chinese takeout containers scattered around us. Jennifer leaned back against her bed frame, chopsticks dangling from her fingers. "You know what's wild?" she said, looking at me. "You're the calmest person I know, but the second your parents call you tense, like you're about to get graded on how you breathe." I stared at my lo mein, trying to shrug it off. "They just expect a lot." Jennifer snorted. "Expect a lot. Claire, they're crushing you." "That's not parenting. That's PR management." Kyle nodded, his expression gentler. I know what it's like wanting them to say they're proud, but you can't let that hold you hostage. You're building your own life here. That's what matters. The truth of it sat heavy in the room. For once, I didn't argue. Around this time, Professor Susan Rosenberg noticed my work. She was known in the department for her high standards, but also her knack for mentoring students who showed potential. After one of my presentations on adolescent development, she pulled me aside. You have a sharp, analytical mind, Claire, she said, adjusting her glasses. And more importantly, you have empathy. Have you considered working on my research team? We're studying resilience in young adults who've faced adversity. The word resilience rang through me. I thought of my grandmother's letter of the countless times I'd fought back tears in my childhood bedroom. Yes, I said quickly, my heart pounding. I'd love to. Being part of that team felt like validation. Late nights in the lab didn't feel like drudgery. They felt like purpose. I was contributing to something real, something that mattered. And Rosenberg's praise, rare but genuine, was the kind I'd been starved for my entire life. Still, my parents' voices haunted me. Every success carried a shadow of their disapproval, a whisper that it wasn't enough. One night, walking back from the library with Jennifer and Kyle, I finally admitted it out loud. Sometimes I think no matter what I do, they'll never see me. Not really. Jennifer stopped in her tracks. The streetlight caught her sharp features as she looked at me squarely. That's because they don't want to. And that's on them, not you. Kyle nodded. Family isn't just the people you share DNA with. Family is the ones who show up and stay no matter what. Jennifer crossed her arms, her voice firm. Exactly. Family isn't who brings you into the world. It's who stands beside you in it. Her words hit me with the force of truth. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe my family wasn't the one I'd been born into, but the one I was building now. The realization brought a strange mixture of grief and comfort. Grief for what I'd never had, and comfort in knowing I wasn't alone anymore. Sitting between Jennifer and Kyle on that quiet Boston street, I felt a warmth that no grand dining room could ever give me. And deep inside, a fragile hope began to take root. Senior year at Northeastern was a blur of long nights, coffee-stained notes, and endless hours in the psychology lab. I spent more time with Professor Rosenberg than I did in my own dorm. She pushed me hard, but for the first time I didn't mind the pressure. Unlike my parents, she didn't demand perfection to inflate her own image. She demanded it because she believed I was capable of it. One late afternoon, after presenting preliminary findings on coping mechanisms in young adults, I waited nervously while she leafed through my charts. Her silence made my stomach churn. Finally, she looked up, her sharp eyes softening just slightly. Claire, this is strong work. Very strong. You don't just see the data. You see the people behind it. That's rare. Heat flooded my cheeks. Thank you, Professor. She adjusted her glasses, setting the charts aside. There's something I want you to consider. The Bowman Institute for Human Development in Seattle has an opening for a research associate. They're one of the top centers in the country. I'd be happy to recommend you. Seattle. The word landed like a thunderclap. Across the country, thousands of miles from Boston, from my parents, from everything I'd known. I don't know if I'd even stand a chance, I admitted. You have more than a chance, Rosenberg said firmly. You have potential they'd be foolish to overlook. That night I told Jennifer and Kyle over greasy pizza in the dorm lounge. Kyle leaned back in his chair, grinning. Seattle, that's huge. You'd be insane not to try. Jennifer pointed at me with a breadstick. Forget your parents. If you want it, go for it. Don't you dare let them decide this for you. I smiled weakly, but inside the familiar ache twisted. I could already imagine Richard scoffing at the salary, Margaret dismissing it as unimpressive. I hadn't even applied yet, and I could hear their voices tearing me down. Kyle must have read the look on my face. He leaned forward, his tone softer. Claire, listen. I grew up without anyone telling me I'd make it. No parents to show up at graduation, no one waiting at home. If I can survive that and still build something for myself, you can succeed without their approval. You don't need it. His words sank deep. For once I believed him. Weeks later, an envelope arrived in my campus mailbox, thick and official-looking. My hands shook as I slid a finger under the flap. Inside was a letter printed on heavy cream paper with the Bowman Institute crest at the top. Dear Ms. Matthews, we are pleased to offer you the position of Research Associate beginning August 2024. I had to sit down right there on the hallway floor, my back against the mailboxes. Tears welled in my eyes, but this time they weren't from disappointment. They were from disbelief, from pride, from the overwhelming sense that maybe, just maybe, I was building a life of my own. I carried the letter to the library, clutching it like a secret treasure. At a corner table, I smoothed the pages flat, reading the words over and over until they blurred. My chest tightened with both joy and fear. Then, what would my parents say? Would they dismiss it as a soft science job? Would they sneer at the salary? Compare me to the children of their friends? The questions rattled through me, but then I remembered Evelyn's letter tucked safely in my planner. Her words had carried me this far. She would have been proud. I whispered it aloud, my voice trembling but sure. This is my path, my choice. That night I pinned the offer letter above my desk with a push pin right next to Evelyn's handwriting. For the first time in years, I went to sleep smiling, the faintest glimmer of self-worth steady in my chest. May in Boston smelled like lilacs and fresh pavement after rain, and the campus buzzed with caps and gowns, and the chatter of families spilling onto Northeastern's quad. I lined up with the other psychology majors in my deep navy robe, honor cords draped across my shoulders. My palms were damp, though, not from nerves about the ceremony itself. I'd earned summa cum laude my thesis, defended with praise. No, my nerves came from the sight of Richard and Margaret Matthews gliding into the arena, their presence commanding as always. My father in a tailored gray suit, my mother in cream silk pearls at her throat. They walked to the reserved VIP seats like they owned the place. When my name was called, the applause rose around me, echoing off the rafters. I stepped onto the stage, my heart pounding with something between triumph and dread. The dean shook my hand, announced my honors, and for a fleeting second I let myself feel proud. I scanned the crowd, searching for their faces. Richard was glancing at his watch. Margaret smoothed the hem of her dress, her gaze drifting. Neither clapped with the fervor of parents celebrating their only child's accomplishment. The moment dulled, but I forced a smile as I walked across the stage, diploma case in hand. When I sat down, the noise of other names filled the air, but inside me there was only quiet. Afterward, the campus lawn swelled with families hugging, crying, taking pictures in the bright sunlight. My classmates were surrounded by parents holding bouquets, siblings waving signs, proud smiles everywhere. I spotted my parents standing apart near the psychology building, already posed for photographs, Richard with his camera around his neck. "There she is," Margaret said when I reached them, her tone more like a hostess greeting a guest than a mother greeting her daughter. She stepped forward and tugged at my sleeve. "Straighten up, Claire. No one wants photos of poor posture." I obeyed automatically, spine stiffening. Richard adjusted the settings on his expensive camera, barking small instructions. "Hold the diploma up higher. Good. Now one with your mother. Claire, chin up. Yes, like that." The smile on my face ached. Their words weren't, "We're proud of you," or "Congratulations." They were critiques, as if the only thing that mattered was how the photographs would look to others. A passing student offered to snap a family photo. Richard handed over the camera with a polite nod, slipping into position beside me. Margaret clasped my arm, smiling her practiced smile. The shutter clicked. I felt like a prop. "Wonderful," Richard said as he reviewed the shot. "We'll have to frame that for the office." The ceremony was well organized, he added matter-of-factly, as though it were a board meeting. "Your hair looks nice pulled back." Margaret noted, already distracted by her reflection in a window. Not a word about my 4 years of work, the sleepless nights, the research I'd poured my heart into. Just logistics and appearances. For a moment my chest tightened with the urge to confront them, to ask why I was never enough, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I inhaled, forcing air into my lungs, and nodded politely. We walked toward the parking area together, their small talk filling the air. Richard mentioned a case he had won recently. Margaret described the menu for an upcoming charity gala. I trailed a step behind, listening without really hearing, clutching my diploma case like it might anchor me. When my father suggested dinner, my pulse leapt. "There's a French place downtown L'Ardoise," he said. "I hear it's excellent." I looked up quickly. Dinner together. "Yes, of course," he replied, as if it were obvious. A proper meal to mark the occasion. Hope flickered, fragile and glowing. Maybe this was it. Maybe the celebration I'd longed for, the acknowledgement I craved, would finally come over a shared table. Margaret gave me a once-over, eyes sweeping my navy dress. "It will do," she said with a small nod. "No need to change." Her words weren't warm, but I clung to them like scraps. As we reached the car, Richard handed his keys to the valet. 6:30 reservation, he said briskly. "We'll head straight there." I slipped into the back seat, my diploma across my lap. Outside the window, Boston shimmered in the late afternoon sun, the city alive with celebration. Inside the car, my parents carried on their usual conversations. Court cases, galas, connections. While I sat silent, a mixture of dread and desperate hope swirling in my chest, I whispered to myself so quietly they couldn't hear, "Dinner will be different. They'll see me this time." L'Ardoise shimmered under golden chandeliers, the kind of place where the tablecloths were pressed so sharply they could cut you, and the servers moved like shadows in black and white. The maitre d' greeted my parents by name, leading us to a corner table with a view of the city lights. I followed, clutching my purse, trying to convince myself this evening might hold something different. Richard ordered a bottle of Burgundy before the menus had even been handed out. His tone casual, authoritative, as if he owned the vineyard. Margaret adjusted her pearl earrings, glancing around at the other diners. "Do you see who's here?" she whispered. "That's Judge Callahan. And over there the Whitmores. Boston's circles always end up at the same table, don't they?" I smoothed my dress and tried to smile. The waiter poured wine, crimson swirling in crystal glasses. My father raised his glass. "To graduation," he said simply, his eyes already scanning the menu. "To graduation," Margaret echoed, though her attention was fixed on a woman in a sequined dress across the room. I took a sip, the expensive wine sharp on my tongue. My hands trembled slightly, but I steadied them on the edge of the table. I had promised myself I would share my news tonight. Maybe, just maybe, they would surprise me. So I began, my voice careful. I received an offer from the Bowman Institute in Seattle. A research associate position. It's one of the most respected centers in the country. Richard didn't even look up. He cut into his foie gras, chewing slowly before replying. "And the salary," I gave the figure, which for me was respectable, more than enough to live on and grow. A short laugh burst from him, sharp as glass. "That's what my junior paralegals make. Without the prestige, without the future." The heat crawled up my neck. "It's a starting point. There's advancement, so publishing, teaching, influencing policy." Margaret interrupted, laying her fork down with a delicate clink. "Claire, with your body right now, no one is going to take you seriously. In professional settings, appearance is half the battle. You can't let yourself go like this." Her words cut deeper than the wine. I stared down at my plate, my hands curling into fists beneath the table. The silence stretched heavy, suffocating. I forced myself to breathe. The work I'll be doing matters. It's about resilience, about helping young people recover from adversity. It changes lives. Richard finally looked at me, eyes narrowing. Resilience. "That's not work, Claire. That's talking in circles while the real players make decisions. You could have been a surgeon, a lawyer. Instead, you'll sit in some office asking people about their feelings. I swallowed hard, my throat raw. It's my choice. Margaret's sigh was theatrical, the kind meant for an audience. Your father and I have tolerated this indulgence, but it has to stop. Passion doesn't pay the mortgage. Respectability does. The waiter arrived with the main courses, setting plates before us. Filet mignon for Richard Seabass, for Margaret roasted duck for me. The interruption gave me a moment to steady my hands, but not my heart. Dinner went on like that. Small talk about their cases, their galas punctuated by jabs at my career, my appearance, my choices. I sat in silence, eating bites I could barely taste. My chest ached with every word unsaid, every defense that died on my tongue. When Richard ordered another bottle of wine, I thought maybe he'd toast again, maybe this time to me. He lifted his glass, his voice calm, almost rehearsed. Claire, today marks the end of your education. And while it is not the path we would have chosen, your mother and I acknowledge your persistence. Something flickered in me, a spark of hope, but it died the moment his expression hardened. However, he continued, we cannot ignore the disappointment. You had the intelligence, the test scores, the opportunities to do something meaningful. Instead, you chose a soft science with questionable value. When we see other parents celebrating children who will become doctors, lawyers, business leaders, well, he paused, letting the silence settle like a verdict. Then he looked me dead in the eye and said, sometimes we wish you had never been born. At least then we wouldn't have to explain your choices to our friends. The words struck like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. My glass froze halfway to my lips. I couldn't breathe. Margaret didn't flinch. She nodded slightly as if he'd merely stated an uncomfortable truth. Around us, I felt the atmosphere shift. A waiter carrying dessert menus stopped abruptly, his eyes darting between us before retreating. At the next table, a couple glanced over, then quickly away. A young man near the bar raised his phone, discreetly recording. The room spun. My hands gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. For 22 years I had bent and twisted myself for their approval, prayed for a word of pride, a gesture of love. And in one sentence they told me my very existence was a burden. I looked at them. My father calmly sipping wine, my mother dabbing the corner of her mouth with a napkin. And I felt something inside me crack wide open. Not collapse, not surrender, but clarity. The restaurant hummed back to life around us, forks clinking, glasses filling. But at our table the silence was deafening, and I sat there trembling, knowing nothing would ever be the same again. The stem of my glass shook between my fingers, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. My chest heaved once, then steadied. I set the glass down, with deliberate care, pushed back my chair and rose to my feet. The scrape of wood against marble cut through the low murmur of the restaurant. If that's what you wish, I said, my voice carrying farther than I expected, then consider me as if I never existed. The air shifted, conversations faltered, forks clinked to a halt. A wave of whispers rippled from table to table, as if the entire room had leaned in to listen. Richard's face darkened, his hand tightening around the stem of his wine glass. Claire, he hissed, his jaw tight. Sit down immediately. You're making a scene. I looked at him, at the man who had demanded perfection my entire life, and for the first time I didn't feel fear. No, I said quietly but firmly. Not this time. Not ever again. Margaret's eyes darted around the room, panic flickering as she caught the stares of the Whitmores, 2 tables over Judge Callahan at the bar, the phones being discreetly lifted. Claire, lower your voice, she urged, her smile strained, her lips trembling as though she could still control the narrative. But I was past control. My body no longer belonged to their script. For 22 years, I continued, I have tried to earn your approval. To be smart enough, perfect enough, quiet enough. I see now it was never possible. Not because I failed, but because you were never capable of loving me as I am. Gasps fluttered from nearby tables. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." A server dropped a spoon, the clatter loud in the frozen silence. Richard shoved his chair back, standing now, his stature looming. "Claire, this ends now. Apologize to your mother. Sit down. I picked up my clutch, sliding the strap over my shoulder with steady hands. No. This ends now, but not the way you want. From this moment forward, you don't have to explain me, my choices, or my existence to anyone. I release you from that burden. Margaret's composure cracked, her voice shrill, desperate. Do you know how this looks? People are watching. That's the point, I cut in, my eyes locked on hers. They can finally see what I've lived with my entire life. The tension broke like a string snapping. A low buzz of shocked conversations swelled across the restaurant phones, angled openly now. I could feel every eye on me, the weight of collective judgment. But for once, it didn't crush me. It lifted me. I turned and walked toward the exit, each step echoing against the marble floor. My legs shook, but my chin stayed high. Behind me, I heard Richard's voice rising sharp and furious, but I didn't stop. As I reached the door, I glanced back only once. My parents were still at the table, frozen under the scrutiny of their peers. Richard's face was flushed crimson. Margaret's hand covered her mouth, her perfect mask shattered. The maitre d', usually composed, looked caught between duty and disbelief. Diners whispered behind menus, their gazes shifting between me and my parents. A woman in sequins shook her head slowly, her lips pressed tight with judgment. The power that had defined my parents for decades, the aura they wore like armor, cracked under the fluorescent lights of a restaurant where their own daughter had just denounced them. I pushed through the heavy glass doors into the night air. The city hummed around me, cars rolling down Boylston Street, laughter spilling from bars. The cool breeze hit my face, drying the tears that had finally spilled down my cheeks. For a moment I stood frozen on the sidewalk, clutching my purse, heart pounding. The weight of 22 years pressed down on me. And then, as I took my first steps away from L'Ardoise, it lifted. Behind me, through the tall windows, I caught one last glimpse of them. 2 figures seated stiffly at a table, no longer untouchable, no longer invincible. Their image, their precious reputation had been pierced. Every eye inside had followed me out the door, and for the first time in my life I felt the strength of being truly seen. Jennifer's apartment smelled faintly of coffee and ink stacks of half-read newspapers spilling off the dining table. The moment she opened the door, I collapsed into her arms. She didn't ask questions. She just held me firm and steady while the sobs I'd been holding back at L'Ardoise tore through me. "Come in," she whispered, guiding me to the couch. "You don't have to explain yet. Just breathe." I sank into the cushions, clutching a pillow like a life raft. My face burned from humiliation, from grief, from fury. The sound of clinking glasses, the hush of whispers, the words my father had said. "We wish you had never been born," echoed on repeat until my chest felt raw. Jennifer disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a steaming mug. "Chamomile," she said, pressing it into my hands. I wrapped my fingers around it, letting the warmth soak into me. A knock came at the door 20 minutes later. Kyle stepped in, his expression dark the moment he saw me. I heard he said, voice taut. Half the city probably heard by now. He set a bag of groceries on the counter. "We're not letting them do this to you again." I stared at him, startled. "What do you mean?" Jennifer sat beside me, crossing her legs. "We mean it's time to cut them off. For good. No more phone calls, no more emails, no more letting them yank your chain." "You deserve peace, Claire." Kyle nodded. "And I can make sure they can't reach you. New number, scrub your social media, lock down your email. You'll be untouchable." The thought scared me. Cutting them off completely felt like sawing off a limb, but the bruises they left were too deep to ignore. I took a shaky sip of tea. "Do you really think I can just disappear?" Jennifer leaned closer, her voice fierce. "Disappear? No. Reclaim. You don't owe them your presence, not after what they said." I closed my eyes. Evelyn's letter flickering in my memory. Don't let their coldness convince you otherwise. By midnight, the 3 of us were hunched over Kyle's laptop. He typed rapidly, explaining as he went. "I'm deleting old accounts, creating new ones with privacy settings maxed out. They'll hit a wall if they try to search you." I scrolled through my phone, deleting contacts, blocking numbers, watching years of connection dissolve with each tap. When I reached Dad and Mom, my hand froze. "Do it," Jennifer urged, my thumb pressed down. "Block. Delete." The silence afterward felt deafening. The next morning, I walked into a bank branch on Huntington Avenue, clutching a checkbook. My account was tied to theirs, remnants from high school. I opened a new account under just my name, transferring everything that was mine. Then I wrote a check addressed to Richard and Margaret Matthews, every cent they'd covered after Evelyn died. On the memo line, my hand trembled, but I forced the words, "This clears any debt between us." I sealed it in an envelope and slid it across the counter at the post office. My chest hurt, but also, strangely, it felt lighter. 2 days later, Jennifer stormed into our study session, waving a folded newspaper. "Page 3, she said, eyes gleaming. The headline read, "The Hidden Scars of Perfection. Stories of Toxic Parenting in Boston's Elite." No names were mentioned, but the descriptions were unmistakable. The pressure, the public image, the cruelty behind closed doors. She'd written it under a pseudonym, her voice sharp and unapologetic. "It's not just you," she said when I looked up, startled. "There are others. But your story, it's going to shake this city." Kyle whistled low. "You realize every gala, committee, and country club in Boston is going to be gossiping about this for months." I stared at the column, my throat thick. For years, my parents had controlled the narrative. Now someone else had cracked it open. That evening, as twilight spread across the Charles River, I stood by Jennifer's window with the paper in hand. The city lights glowed like embers, the hum of traffic rising steady and indifferent. I traced the words on the page with my finger, a single thought anchoring me. Finally, I whispered, "The truth is out." Seattle greeted me with mist that clung to the streets, and the smell of coffee that seemed to seep from every corner cafe. My new apartment in Capitol Hill was small, a studio with peeling paint and creaky floorboards, but it was mine. No portraits of Richard looming from the walls, no staged perfection. I slept on a mattress on the floor my first week, surrounded by boxes, and felt freer than I ever had in the grand Back Bay house. The Bowman Institute stood on the edge of Lake Union, a sleek glass building that reflected the gray skies. On my first day, I walked in with my resume clutched in one hand and Evelyn's letter in the other, folded and hidden in my bag. Dr. Elaine Whitman. My new supervisor was brisk and efficient. She scanned my file, her sharp eyes narrowing on my transcript. "Summa cum laude," she said. "Rosenberg spoke highly of you. See? I expect thorough work, Matthews. But you'll have room to grow here." "Yes, Dr. Whitman," I said, heart hammering. For once the pressure didn't crush me. It energized me. The weeks filled quickly with designing protocols, interviewing participants, and analyzing mountains of data. Late nights at the Institute didn't drain me. They fueled me. Each morning I arrived with a sense of purpose, something I'd never felt at home. Back at the apartment, I began to find a rhythm. One evening, as I struggled with a box that refused to fit down the recycling chute, the girl across the hall appeared. She was petite, with black hair pulled into a messy bun, her t-shirt splattered with paint. "Need a hand?" she asked, balancing a canvas under one arm. Desperately, I admitted, laughing. Together, we shoved the box into place until it finally gave way. She stuck out her hand, grinning. "Sophia Nguyen, graphic designer, and apparently part-time recycling consultant." "Claire," I said, shaking her hand, surprised at how natural it felt. Within days, Sophia was knocking on my door with homemade spring rolls, inviting me to her book club. Soon, I found myself in her living room, surrounded by strangers who quickly became less than strangers. Teachers, artists, baristas, all laughing, talking, debating novels and movies. For the first time, I belonged somewhere without effort. But Boston wasn't finished with me. One rainy Tuesday, I arrived at the Institute to find an email flagged in my inbox. The subject line, "From your parents." My stomach dropped. I clicked it open. "Claire," We are attending a conference in Seattle next month. It would be appropriate for us to meet. Your behavior has caused significant distress and we must address the public damage. Please suggest a time and place. Not a word about my well-being. Not a word about regret. Only distress, public damage, appropriate. I stared at the screen, the hum of the office fading. They hadn't changed. Not even humiliation could strip them of their obsession with image. Later that evening, Sophia found me sitting on the apartment steps, the rain misting against my hair. "Hey," she said softly, holding out an umbrella. "You look like the world just dropped a brick on you." I showed her the email. She read it once, then again shaking her head. "They don't want you, Claire. They want control. There's a difference." Her words lingered long after she left. I folded my arms around myself, the city lights blurring through the drizzle. They hadn't written because they missed me. They had written because they were afraid. Afraid of whispers in Boston, afraid of their reputations crumbling further. That night I lay awake in my small studio listening to the rain against the window. I thought of Evelyn, of Jennifer, and Kyle, of the fragile community I was beginning to build here. And I understood with a certainty that steadied me that my parents' email wasn't a bridge. It was another chain. I wasn't going to let them clasp it around my neck again. The ballroom in Chicago was filled with rows of white chairs, the kind that creaked when people shifted but still managed to look dignified under the bright stage lights. A massive banner stretched across the back wall National Conference on Human Development 2027. My name was printed in the program alongside seasoned professors and authors whose work I had once underlined in borrowed textbooks. Now at 31, I stood among them. The podium felt tall under my hands as I adjusted the microphone. My slides flickered to life on the screen behind me, graphs and case studies that had consumed years of my life. My voice carried through the room calm and measured, though inside I felt the familiar flutter of nerves. Only this time it wasn't fear of disapproval. It was the weight of being fully seen. I spoke about resilience in adolescence, about the power of validation, about how one moment of being truly heard could alter the course of a young person's life. I quoted data, but I also told stories. The foster youth who found stability, the quiet student who blossomed when encouraged. And somewhere in the middle, without planning to, I found myself speaking about invisibility. Too often, I said, scanning the audience, children grow up in homes where achievement is demanded, but affection is withheld. They learn to measure their worth by how well they perform, not by who they are. That kind of love is conditional, and it leaves scars. For a beat, the silence was total. Then I saw heads nodding. A woman in the front row dabbed her eyes. A man scribbled notes furiously. When I reached the conclusion, I let my gaze drop for a moment to the silver necklace resting against my collarbone. The small phoenix pendant gleamed under the stage lights, the gift Jennifer and Kyle had given me years before I left Boston. My fingers brushed against it, grounding me. This research isn't just about numbers I finished, it's about people. And it's about remembering that no one's worth depends on someone else's ability to see it. The applause began slowly, then built until the room was on its feet. I blinked, stunned, my chest swelling as the sound rolled over me. For years I had begged for claps from the wrong hands. Now I didn't need my parents' approval to know I mattered. As the ovation continued, memories surged. The night at L'Ardoise, my father's words slicing through me, my mother's complicit nod, the shame that had once buried me. But the vision that lingered wasn't their faces. It was Evelyn's smile, Jennifer's fierce loyalty, Kyle's steady encouragement, Sophia's kindness, Marcus's quiet support. It was the family I had chosen. I whispered under my breath so softly no one else could hear. I've been reborn. After the session ended, colleagues approached me asking about collaborations, congratulating me. I shook hands, smiled, accepted their praise with gratitude, but my thoughts kept circling back to that necklace, to the promise I had made years ago. That night, in the quiet of my hotel room, I opened my laptop and reread the email my parents had sent 2 years earlier, the last real attempt they'd made to reach me. It had been about appearances, about how my absence reflected poorly on them. They never apologized, never acknowledged the wound they had carved into me. I no longer needed them to. Standing by the window looking out at the city lights, I thought of the young version of me clutching a torn acceptance letter in the kitchen, tears burning as Richard told me psychology was worthless. I thought of the girl at 12 holding a silver trophy, aching for approval that never came. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her the truth, that she was already enough. Voice-over filled my thoughts, words I wanted to offer, not just to myself but to anyone listening. The night my father said he wished I had never been born, I thought my world had ended. But what ended was their power over me. That moment became the beginning of my rebirth. I became the person I chose to be. And I learned that worth is not something given by others. It is something we already carry inside us. Sometimes the family we build matters more than the one we're born into. I exhaled long and steady, letting the weight of the past finally loosen its grip. If you've ever carried words meant to break you, I want you to know you are not alone. Share your story. Let others hear it. Because the truth has power and so do you. Stay with me because here our stories don't end in silence. They rise just like a phoenix from the ashes.